And it's my privilege, actually an honor, to introduce to you tonight our own Millbury citizen, scholar, Mr. Roger Desrosiers.
Thank you, Dennis. But I like the other 7-letter word, okay, student of the Constitution. I don't think I qualify yet as a scholar because I keep learning and learning all the time. Thank you so much, everyone. Without the support of the Asa Waters Mansion and its executive director, Tracy Parath, these lectures, okay, would not have occurred. So thank you, Tracy. Once again, I'd also like to thank our friends of the Asa Waters Mansion for their hospitality and their amazing treats. I'm kind of wondering, okay, a lot of people get here early, so I'm kind of wondering whether or not many of the people are coming here more for the treats than they are coming to see me. Also, again, my sincere gratitude to Carrie Chapman for her incredible help with the slides accompanying the lectures and her sound advice for me as I prepared each lecture, and to Kevin Chrysopoulos for filming and the lecture series, ably assisted last week by Jeff Dorr and today by Max Martel. Kevin has posted these on the website, so on the YouTube. So the first 2 are on the YouTube. Probably by the end of the week, last week's lecture will be posted. And this one eventually will be posted as well. And they'll be on the Mansion's website, or the Mansion's Facebook as well. Okay, and so Tracy just said that these will be on the Mansion's website as well. So, and I've already heard from several people who have not been able to attend in person, which is amazing. They've listened to have listened to what's on YouTube as well, which is great. I'd also like to thank the audience. Many of you have been here for all 4 lectures. Kudos to all of you for being able to do that. That's great. That's incredible, as a matter of fact. I'm hopeful that more of these lectures can spread throughout the state and our nation going forward. With your help and your insistence, they will. So, let's see. So now let's go into our final lecture, Withstanding Crises, Enduring Past, Current, and Future Challenges. So if you wish to help further our work, several of you have indicated, okay, that you might want to help. So I put a thing on the board over here. We have a PayPal account. If you want to contribute and help us with our work, you can go to our PayPal and go to the Massachusetts Center for Civic Education, and that would assist us, okay, down the road as we continue to try to do our work. We, as you've heard for several weeks, okay, our Citizen Lyceum and what it intends to do. We've talked about the American Lyceum, okay, celebrating its 200th anniversary next year. There are going to be several events, okay, that we hope to be able to continue to do to demonstrate, okay, how the Lyceum works. But I'm also would like to let you know that there are going to be there's another 200th anniversary, as Dennis has alluded to, which is that the Asa Waters Mansion is celebrating the 200th anniversary of the construction of this home. And so starting next year, be tuned in, those of you especially from Millbury, okay, there are going to be a lot of events that are going to be starting in the 2026 And you can come by and celebrate, okay, those events, okay, with us as we continue to honor this incredible facility. I think many of you who have been here for the first time, I think, are in awe of how well kept this building is and how wonderful, okay, this opportunity is. Many of us look at this as the jewel or the gem of Millbury. So we're very fortunate that we have this incredible facility. Also, as many of you also know, this is the 250th anniversary coming up in 2026, and so there will be celebrations of that as well. So 2026 certainly looks like a bonus year for celebration. So as you read this, okay, you will see that the 250-year history of the United States has its share of crises, both domestic and international. Despite that, okay, we have survived. We've been able to get through these crises, and mostly because of our people. We've found ways to come together. Tonight, we're going to take a look through our history and find, okay, how we may have done so. So we have a big challenge tonight. I certainly do. In less than 2 hours, I hope, I'll try and look through our history and demonstrate, okay, this very thing. And, trying to do 250 years of history in less than 2 hours certainly is a challenge. It was a challenge for me to do that, okay, in a 1 year of history, never mind a year and a half of history when I was teaching. So bear with me. Let's start off with the evolution, okay, of political parties. Political parties did not exist at the time the Constitution was written. Yes, as you noted perhaps last week, we did talk about the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, okay, who were debating the Constitution, but they weren't formally political parties. Through the essays that you saw, we saw the Federalists who basically supported the Constitution, who were opposed by what became known as the Anti-Federalists. And they, of course, okay, wrote essays opposing it. So it should not have come as a surprise that when the government was put into effect, that there would be, okay, this kind of discussion that would go on whereby you were going to have people opposing and supporting various points of view. Well, let's look at the fact that as we examine political parties over the years, there are advantages in which political parties are supported. If we look at other countries, many have a multitude of parties. And in those countries that do so, one party typically has a difficulty of being able to gain enough support in order for that party to be able to generate enough support for that party to be able to rule. So oftentimes what those countries will do is they have to join forces with other political parties in order for them to be able to rule. We call those coalition governments. We have not had that issue in our country, largely because we have, for all practical purposes, had just the two-party system. The occasional third parties that we've had have never registered or had that much of an impact that has caused us to have what we call a coalition government. With the two-party system, however, alternative views have difficulties to gain the political support like the Green Party, the Libertarian, or the Reform parties of the past decades, which are some of the newer parties, if you will, that are third parties. notice that those parties have particular points of view and have a more difficulty of trying to gain traction, if you will, because they're funneled, okay, to a particular point of view. Washington's farewell address in 1796 had a very interesting concern. He was concerned, okay, having witnessed within his own administration, he saw what was happening with people that he trusted and people that he felt very comfortable with, where they became very bitter enemies. Alexander Hamilton, who supported, okay, a national bank, and Thomas Jefferson, okay, who, okay, was very upset because he felt that that was not something, okay, that the country should do. And the result of which, okay, were the basic establishment of two political parties. And the friendship, whatever that might have been, okay, was destroyed, okay, through the political parties that had been created during that particular time. So the issue of political parties raised the concerns that Washington already had with regard to how the political parties, in his mind, okay, caused his, okay, negative view on political parties. So this particular quote has a great deal, okay, of anguish in his mind as to what those political parties, okay, could do to the United States. I think it's interesting if you look at it, as others have noted in the past, as to, okay, what political parties and the damage, okay, that they can do. If you look at the next quote by George Washington, the party agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another, foments occasional riot and insurrection. It opens the door to foreign influence and corruption, which find a facilitated access to the government itself through the channels of party passions. That was written over 200 years ago. So you can understand where George Washington's views, okay, on party were, okay, understood based upon not only his witnessing within his administration, but also how parties during that time had influenced what he had seen through English history as well as histories, okay, around the world before then. So the importance here is when you read Washington's farewell address, which dealt with many different issues, 2/5 of the Washington address deals with his concerns about political parties. Now, when we get to the election of 1800, this in many ways demonstrates the fierceness of the political party animosities that had evolved over the first decade of the government's history. In 1796 election, John Adams was elected president, but Thomas Jefferson was elected vice president. Adams was a Federalist. Thomas Jefferson was a Democratic Republican. Following the wording of the original Constitution, that's the way it was supposed to be. The first candidate with the greatest amount of electoral votes became president. The person with the second amount became vice president. Remember, political parties did not exist at the time in which the Constitution was written. Therefore, that, okay, understanding was not, okay, predicted. When the election of 1800 came about, the Democratic Republicans, concerned that something similar could occur, determined that the electors should make sure that the president and vice president, okay, would be from the same party. What they didn't expect was that 73 votes, okay, would be for Thomas Jefferson, and 73 votes would be for Aaron Burr. The original Constitution said if there was a tie, the House of Representatives had to choose who the president would be. Aaron Burr, even though the Democratic Republicans had wanted Jefferson to be president, Aaron Burr wasn't giving up the opportunity of his being selected by the House of Representatives as president. So already a rift was already in the making between president and vice president, when in actuality Thomas Jefferson did get elected after many ballots. How to solve the problem? The 12th Amendment. So the 12th Amendment ended up creating a separate ballot for president and a separate ballot for the vice president, so that that would not occur in the future. So that has resolved that. What's the most significant part of the election of 1800 is that we had the peaceful transfer of power. And ever since then, every election was a peaceful transfer of power, even though we have had some very difficult elections whereby there were contentious results. 1824 election, 1860 election, 1876 election, 1960 election, 2000. I'll mention 1960. President Kennedy only won by 123,000 votes. Nixon could easily have contested it. 2000, many of us were certainly alive and aware there wasn't a very big difference. It could have been contentious enough, okay, there could have been, okay, a difficulty, and yet Al Gore gave a very wonderful, okay, speech of concession. Unfortunately, in 2020, the peaceful transfer of power ceased. History of political parties. The history of the political parties are relatively simple without the fact that, okay, we've had several third parties over time. But for all practical purposes, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, okay, lasted until around 1820. Federalists slowly died out. They were eventually replaced by the Whig Party on similar, okay, types of issues. The Whig Party, okay, itself is going to fall apart, and it's going to be eventually replaced by the Republican Party in 1854, with the first elected party being Abraham Lincoln in 1860. And since then, we've essentially had two basic parties, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Now, we've had, as you noted, a few third parties. Some of the most contentious were 1860, 1912, 1980, 1992, and 2000. The only election in which a third party candidate won in second place was 1912, where the Bull Moose Party, okay, replaced the Republican Party as the second place. That's where Teddy Roosevelt, okay, beat out William Howard Taft in the 1912 election. A second major challenge, of course, everybody would expect, okay, we would talk about the Civil War, but also would talk about its aftermath. Can't talk about one without talking about the other. Using the argument that states have the right to nullify acts of the federal government that were articulated by both Madison and Jefferson in 1798, and then reiterated in the 1830s by John C. Calhoun, and then by Southern leaders up to the Civil War, the Southern states, through their legislative actions, through judicial decisions and events, tried to increase the presence of slavery. So the issue was always states' rights. From their point of view, as we increased our territories, they are using the argument that they had the right to negate the laws that were trying to prevent them from being able to do what they needed to do with their property. The several events that I'm listing, okay, just show that difference. The Missouri Compromise in 1820 was going to upset, okay, the legislative issue like we talked about a couple of weeks ago. If you recall, when we talked about the issue of the Senate having 2 members of each state, but the House had representation according to population. Well, they did not want to see Maine, which wanted to free itself of us, Massachusetts. So Missouri, okay, was ready to come into the Union, and so the Missouri Compromise was allowing Missouri to come in as a slave state, and Maine would come in as a free state. And that would allow, therefore, Missouri to be able to have, okay, members of the House that would equal the number of slaves that they were going to have, that would allow for them more representation. And then we have the Mexican War, which enlarged the number of territories. That would include California, which then wanted to be a free state, but there were other, okay, territories that were involved as well. A tightening up in the Compromise of 1850 of the fugitive slave trade. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, which was now going to throw out the Missouri Compromise, which had established, okay, the 3630 line that was no longer going to be able to determine where slaves could exist. They were now going to allow Kansas and Nebraska to decide themselves whether to be slave or free, thus basically nullifying, okay, the Missouri Compromise. The Dred Scott versus Sanford case, which was the case in which the Supreme Court justice and its justices that agreed, okay, determined that slaves were property and therefore had no rights, and thus, okay, allowed for them to be going wherever, okay, the slave owners wished. And then, of course, you had the John Brown's raid, which was condemned by the South and supported by the North. And, of course, the election of 1860, which was the culminating event that essentially brought about the secession of the South. So the galvanizing event that really, okay, really started the war was the election of 1860. Once Abraham Lincoln, okay, was elected, the South realized that essentially they had no more opportunity to be able to do what they wished. Now, Abraham Lincoln only won 39.7% of the popular vote. But, as you know, he had to win the majority of the Electoral College, which he did. So despite the fact that he did not have, okay, a majority of the popular vote, did not matter, because the Constitution says you only need to have the majority of the Electoral College. However, 39.7% is the lowest percentage of any candidate or any president who's ever had the vote. But you had 3 other candidates. There were 4 candidates for president. And so therefore, that's where the split, okay, comes. And that's why, okay, it was so contentious. So, with Lincoln having been elected in November of 1860, South Carolina secedes in December. 6 more states secede before the end of February. So when Abraham Lincoln takes the oath of office on March the 4th of 1861, 7 states have already seceded. And that's what he's faced with. On April 12th, 1861, Fort Sumter is attacked, and thus the beginning of the Civil War. Notice, civil wars are exactly as they're portrayed. Mary Todd Lincoln was from Kentucky. She had brothers who fought for the Confederacy. That was certainly not unusual for many people of the border states in particular, whose families were split apart, okay, by the Civil War. When the war ended, which was 4 years later, on April the 9th of 1865, the Confederates, okay, surrendered. However, that was not the end of the war. As we know, many people, okay, refused to accept the results. The Union fought it for unity and eventually for freeing the slaves. When Lincoln passed the Emancipation Proclamation on when he announced it, it was in September of 1862. It went into effect on January 1st of 1863. It only impacted those slaves who were under the control of the Confederate States. It did not apply to any slaves who were in border states that were slave states, or in areas of Confederacy that were under the control of the Union forces. For all practical purposes, the Emancipation Proclamation was an illegal document that had no force. However, it allowed for the military to be able to enlist black troops. And that enabled, okay, black soldiers to train and fight for the Union. As the war was winding down, Lincoln pushed for the 13th Amendment, which would now legally end slavery for all African Americans. And that occurred early in 1865. As you may know from the movie, okay, this was not an easy task. Movie was great, by the way. It does depict, okay, the political means by which all of this occurred. So if you haven't seen the movie, it's a good movie to watch because the political intrigue is very good.
What movie?
Lincoln.
Lincoln?
The name of it is Lincoln.
Lincoln, okay. The name of the movie, huh?
The 13th Amendment, isn't it?
The name of the movie.
Isn't that called 13th Amendment? I think so.
By Spielberg, it's Lincoln.
Where's Lincoln?
Lincoln, okay.
Is that the one?
Yeah, Spielberg movie. When Lincoln won a second term in the contested election, and believe me, it was very contested. This war had been going on for 4 years. Many, Northerners were not very pleased that this war was still going on, not very pleased, that many soldiers were dying, that many people, were losing their lives. That didn't necessarily mean, that they wanted this war to continue. So the result is Lincoln, was not necessarily expected to win a second term. He was not popular in many, many regards. But he did win. And when he won, and he gave his inaugural speech, this is what he ended his speech with. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. As you can see from his words, as the war was winding down, his intent is certainly to make sure that the South was not going to be condemned and was not going to be treated in a harmful way. However, on April 14th, 5 days after the war ended, President Lincoln was shot and killed. Reconstruction would take place under different leadership, and the radical Republicans are going to take greater control over punishing the South. As a summary, the Civil War amendments, which are the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, we have studied them in the past. So we've looked at these in the last couple of weeks, so it's a kind of a summary. The 13th Amendment, essentially frees the slaves. The 14th Amendment, 3 years later, as we discussed last week, overturned the Dred Scott decision, gave citizenship rights to everyone born in the United States, as well as the due process rights in their states, as well as equal protection of the laws. We talked about those last week. The 15th Amendment was necessary simply because the southern states were doing everything they could to prevent African American males from voting. And so a separate amendment, needed to be passed in 1870 to protect their right to vote. So as you can see, despite the fact that laws were in place, the fact of the matter was the Southerners, with their black codes and other, the KKK was on the rise. There were many ways in which, the Confederacy, was still trying, to make sure that slavery in a different form was still available and still working. Reconstruction lasted until 1877. The military that was in the South was very unpopular because the military was there to make sure that the laws that the radical Republicans were put in place were going to force the southern states to do what the northern states wanted them to do. That's not going to work very well. And that memory is not going to be favorable among the southern states. So what happened in 1877 to change that attitude? An election. A very close election, one of our most contested elections. The election of 1876 ended up with 8 electoral votes that had 2 slates of electors that were contested. What are you going to do? So they set up an electoral commission to determine, well, you're going to have 8 votes. Which ones are you going to accept? You had 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats. How do you think it worked? Very smart audience. So it was Rutherford B. Hayes who won the election by getting all 8 contested. And I believe the vote was 188 to 187. With the promise that Reconstruction would end. And with the end of Reconstruction came the military out of the South, and essentially all of what had been accomplished in order to guarantee the rights of African Americans no longer there. So sharecropping, which was existing, now became the norm. Jim Crow laws, were established. Literacy tests, were required. And all kinds of other tests, were made and required that indeed limited African Americans from voting. And then you had Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 that established a policy and a doctrine called separate but equal, which essentially meant if you had a school for white children, you had to have a school for black children. Didn't necessarily mean they had to be good. And that policy lasted for 58 years. But then, did they give up? No. We had Booker T. Washington, Ida Tarbell, W.E.B. Du Bois, and many other African Americans who started other organizations to help African Americans and did whatever they could to give them the rights that they should have. The one organization that most of us are familiar with was the NAACP. But there were other organizations as well. The Niagara Movement being another. In the late 19th and early 20th century, that organization, tried as much as it could to legally promote and help African Americans in different ways. However, lynching during this time period was extremely, popular in the South. Amazing as this may seem, one of the most popular attractions that was done was having children, women, family outings, attending lynchings. In the late 1940s, President Truman, after World War II, will integrate the military through an executive order. Jackie Robinson will be the first, black player in the Major Leagues Baseball. The Brown versus Board of Education versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, was established as law with a 9-0 Supreme Court decision, overturning the Plessy versus Ferguson case. Very unpopular in the South. Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, the bus boycott, federal troops sent to Little Rock, Arkansas, freedom rides in the early 1960s, the lunch counter sit-ins, Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, all of these civil rights movements, activities that were done, were done in order to, allow for African Americans who were freed from slavery by the 13th Amendment in 1865. Another issue, the rise of industrialization. The Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, Carnegie, Morgan, many industrialists were benefiting from inventions, innovations, opportunities, and greed to enlarge their wealth and create vast empires. To do so, the workers needed to make this happen. And they were exploited, as were the consumers in many ways. Workers ended up forming labor unions, which were initially frowned upon by most Americans as interfering with progress. So where does the role of the government come into play? Took a while, because a lot of this was going on, and so what does the government do, when it observes and sees, these monopolies increase and these monopolies going on? So despite initial inattention, many in the government began to be concerned about the reckless behavior of big business and established the first regulatory agency to try and prevent some of the dishonest practices and monopolistic behaviors of these large corporations. So the first regulatory agency is the Interstate Commerce Commission in 1887. It was intended to stop smaller businesses from getting swallowed up by larger ones. It was intended to stop giving rebates to clients that they wanted or certain customers. And it was also, okay, trying to, okay, prevent, okay, workers from getting exploited, okay, by these big businesses. Let's remember what we studied earlier on, and our framers were designing this government. Their role is to protect the people. And in many ways, the origins of administrative agencies is really that very purpose. During the Progressive Age, the industrial monopolistic practices had been around for about 40 years, as you can see. But the middle and poorer classes, okay, were getting squeezed out. And as the result of that, it caused a lot of difficulties, and the middle class was shrinking more and more as a result. The poorer classes, okay, were expelled, for all practical purposes, okay, were not even being considered. Teddy Roosevelt was the first president to openly recognize the concern over what he called bad trusts. He said there were good trusts and there were bad trusts. Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, many of you may remember that from your history classes, opened people's eyes and made the Pure Food and Drug Act possible, which led to the Food and Drug Administration that we have today. So the meatpacking scandal, okay, of, rodents and rodent species and everything that was going into the food packing industry, okay, caused many people to be a little bit concerned about the food that they were eating. So when the Pure Food and Drug Administration, okay, or I should say Act, was passed, it was pretty palatable for them to accept the fact that a Food and Drug Administration was warranted. Teddy Roosevelt, also an environmentalist, a conservationist, okay, also established the National Parks Service. So this was also something that he did, another agency, if you will, to preserve our parks and landmarks.
And this building.
Pardon?
And this building.
And that's right. So these are just two examples, but just gives you an idea, if you will, about the need and the reasoning behind why these kinds of agencies became somewhat important at that time, and hopefully you'll see why they became even more important later. When President Wilson became president, two of the agencies that he created during his time in office were the Federal Trade Commission and the Federal Reserve System. Again, independent agencies, so that those agencies would be able to make decisions independent of the government, so that they could make the decisions for the economy and the economic needs of the country. Yes?
Is it constitutional to have these separate bodies that don't answer to the executive?
Well, that's a good question. And so the question, or the answer I would give you is, the purpose of government is to protect the people. The government was faced with a difficult issue, which was these businesses were doing all kinds of issues that they recognized were not okay, in their mind, enabling anyone to correct or to protect the people. Well, who has the obligation to protect the people? It is the government. And so the leaders decided that the government needs to step in. So, to answer your question, there was nothing in the Constitution other than the preamble of the Constitution that says you need to protect the people and the general welfare. And I believe that became the premise for the government, okay, creating these agencies. So, again, becomes a concern, as many, okay, people will use today, because, well, we'll talk about that in a few moments, but the fact of the matter is, the notion of the government becoming involved in these matters has no direct correlation to what the Constitution states, except for the very purpose of why we have a government. And I believe that, okay, becomes the reasoning. Yes?
Did you say President Wilson did this by executive order?
No. No, these were...
Did Congress vote and approve?
That question I don't know the answer to. That's a good question.
Was this accepted, or did it go to the Supreme Court when he just created these agencies?
To my knowledge, it did not go to the Supreme Court. To my knowledge. I don't know the answer to that.
Thank you.
Yep.
Are there any other agencies that are independent, like the Fed?
Oh, absolutely. Many. Many. We're going to talk about that in a couple of slides. Yep. Yes.
Doesn't Congress actually vote on the power that these agencies have?
Absolutely. Congress, okay, does create these agencies.
But they enumerate the powers of these
That's correct.
agencies. So they can't go beyond what the powers that Congress...
They're not supposed to.
Quote unquote.
Let's put it this way. The agencies, okay, are determined to have, okay, X number of rules and regulations. And some of those regulations and rules, they also increase and make up, okay, as they go along. And is there enough oversight over what they do? That becomes a question that I think many people have today. Those are good questions. So today, so I put that on there. There is or was 441 independent, okay, regulatory agencies. I say was because there are some that don't exist today. The fact of the matter is that some of them are agencies that are part of the cabinet positions. And we're going to talk about a few, just to give you examples. And then there are those that are truly independent, as to your question. In other words, they don't belong to any other, okay, cabinet department or anything else. They are totally independent. But these have come up, and the examples I'm giving you are giving you for the purpose that I want you to recognize have come up throughout the 20th century into the 21st century by different presidents and presidential administrations, both Democrat and Republican, as the exigencies, okay, have required. Because of different issues and different things that were coming up, these kinds of things have occurred. So to use the examples, the CIA is a totally independent agency, does not belong to any cabinet department, and that was created, okay, by President Truman. Okay. Came out of World War II. Big concern, obviously, was everything that was going on through the end of World War II, and obviously our concern with communism and the concern, okay, after the war. So the Central Intelligence Agency was huge. You had the Census Bureau. Census Bureau, even though the census is something that was in the Constitution to be done every 10 years, started in 1790, the Census Bureau was created under Teddy Roosevelt and is part of the Commerce Department. And so it's something that they do, okay, as one of their roles in one of their departments. The NOAA, okay, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency, or Association, Administration rather. This is, okay, the weather, okay, everything about the weather. That's in the Commerce Department, and that was created by President Nixon in the early 70s. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, that was also created by Nixon. That's an independent agency. The FEMA, today it's part of Homeland Security, but that was created by President Carter. The FBI is part of the Justice Department. That was not part of the federal government totally, because it was created in 1908, but became part of the federal government under President Coolidge in the 1920s. NASA became part of an independent agency, completely separate from any cabinet department, and by President Eisenhower. The Peace Corps, many of you perhaps remember, okay, was created by President Kennedy, again, totally independent agency. The Securities and Exchange Commission was created during the New Deal. That was obviously by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The Social Security Administration, which many of us love, okay, was created by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, okay, in the 1930s. And the FAA was created, is now in the Department of Transportation, and that was created by President Eisenhower. The IRS, no surprise to many of you, is part of the Treasury Department, created by Abraham Lincoln, because he had an income tax during that time, which was later on nullified by the Supreme Court, and then we ended up having an IRS once the income tax was, okay, made into an amendment, the 16th Amendment in the 1913. So therefore, okay, it eventually became official. And then USIA, the United States Information Agency, is part of the State Department, and that was created by President Eisenhower. So the bottom line is these and the other 400 more agencies were all created over time in order to make it more palatable, easier for the government to do its business, in order to protect the American people. And now probably is a good time for everybody to take a 5-minute break. Hi, how are you? How's my boy? Of course, when you let everyone go, it's difficult to get them all back. You're in for a treat.
Oh, I, really good.
Okay. Hope you're refreshed. So our next area of challenge is when we get into the area of world leadership in persevering through global crises. The role of the United States changed dramatically in the 20th century. Although the United States in the late 19th century embarked in some imperialistic events like the Spanish-American War, the U.S., for the most part, tried to follow President Washington's advice. And other than the Monroe Doctrine, okay, where the if you will, where the hemispheric address of most of our concerns related to the hemisphere in which we were in. We dealt with the Monroe Doctrine, okay, where we were trying to keep our attention there with the Mexican War and things of that nature. We really hadn't gone too much outside except with the start of the Spanish-American War. Washington's farewell address included the concern he had with foreign entanglements. But let's remember that his concerns were primarily over the fact that we had just won our independence, okay, from Great Britain, with the uncertainty that perhaps other European nations might want to take advantage of our independence, as well as the fact that we weren't necessarily a very strong nation. Spain was our neighbor to the west and to the south. Britain was still our neighbor to the north. France would become our neighbor to the west, okay, with agreements, okay, later on. And so therefore, we weren't necessarily content or concerned, or we were rather concerned, that the European nations might want to take advantage, okay, of our infancy. So those concerns were part and parcel with his concerns about getting involved with foreign entanglements, meaning making agreements and treaties, okay, with different countries that would make us weaker rather than stronger. Well, when we get into the 20th century, all of a sudden, Woodrow Wilson, in his first term, will make the argument that he kept us out of war. Whereas the second term, he will take a different tact. And of course, we had the sinking of the Lusitania. We had some German, okay, movement that made it a little bit more difficult. There's also concern that there were business interests that wanted us to become involved in the war. The fact of the matter is that he made a claim that we needed to be prepared, and as a result, in 1917, the United States indeed did get involved in the war. And of course, he made the claim that it should be to make the world safe for democracy. At that time, there were only 15 countries in the world that were democracies at that time. Later, Wilson was also very intent on trying to be the peacemaker. So as the war was ending, he published his 14 points in which he used arguments about how peace could be achieved. And his final point was the establishment of the League of Nations, a peacekeeping organization that if all the countries, okay, were to join it, that they would essentially keep and help to keep the peace in the world. As an aside, just for those of us who remembered what we talked about in the second week, you'll understand that the United States never joined the League of Nations, even though the League of Nations actually did exist. And the reason was because the Senate, which was primarily Republican, refused to ratify that treaty. So as you remember learning a couple of weeks ago, we learned, okay, that the checks and balance system of our government is that the president may actually work in designing a treaty, but the Senate must approve the treaty. Well, in 1919, they chose not to. And so we never did join the League of Nations. Well, during the 1920s, Germany, Italy, and other countries were devastated because the countries who won essentially sought to punish those who had lost. And of course, in the throes of depression, this was ripe for those who wished to control those countries. And so Hitler and Mussolini in particular, okay, are going to eventually rise to leadership, basically because those countries were not able to survive the depression that followed. Other countries, okay, like the United States, did pretty well. In the 1920s was a strong economic time frame. The only problem is that there were no guardrails. So the economy flourished, but there were no regulations, and the controls, okay, allowed for people to essentially do whatever they wanted to do, and money was, okay, coming out, and people were doing the things that they wanted to do, and they were achieving, okay, tremendous, okay, profits. Even though, you know, in hindsight, one could see perhaps some of these things that were occurring could be, okay, a problem. At that time, no one was really paying enough attention to those. So that in October, or it wasn't in October, okay, certain things occurred. The final straw was October the 29th of 1929, when the Great Depression, okay, began with the stock market crash. The crash was so profound that President Hoover at that time basically believed that the way in which to get out of a depression was for the federal government to do nothing. Because previous depressions and recessions in our government had been handled and had gotten better over time through communities and states where they had either done the things that they needed to do to help people. And so why change, okay, the way things are done? This laissez-faire approach had worked before. Why wouldn't it work now? Rugged individualism was a very, very important feature of Americanism. So it wasn't necessarily, okay, President Hoover or Republicans, okay, basically saying, okay, we're going to not do anything and let people suffer. It was merely history was on their side because we had had depressions in the past and we had been able to, okay, come out of them. Maybe it took a couple of years, but nonetheless, okay, these kinds of things had solved themselves. So that was President Hoover's, okay, basic approach. And that approach, by 1932, didn't work. And of course, as you can see, the Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930 was, okay, a real disaster, because what it ended up doing, okay, is it did not solve the problem, it only aggravated it. By 1932, another election, President Hoover is running for re-election, but the people, okay, are not doing well. Now, we complain about 4% unemployment, 6% unemployment, 7% unemployment. We're pulling our hairs out. 25% unemployment was what was going on in 1932. So you can understand, if 1 out of every 4 people did not have a job, you can understand, okay, why they would have turned to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he wins, okay, that election. Now, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, okay, doesn't necessarily know exactly what he's going to do. But he knows one thing. The American people have lost faith in the United States. And so more than the acts that he is going to propose, one of the first things he does is to try and give people hope. And his fireside chats are the first things that he does to give Americans hope. His 10-day bank holiday is going to be a way in which he is going to try to get the banks solvent. So the bottom line is he takes actions that necessarily aren't what one might call, okay, incredible, but they are actions, okay, that are going to be in some ways giving more hope than, okay, more of the same. And then, of course, the alphabet soup, okay, programs, okay, come out. And then those kind of, okay, also give hope. But they're also in contradiction to pretty much everything that the United States has done up to now. This is no longer laissez-faire. This is government, okay, doing many, many things. And all of these programs are intended to get the Americans off their feet in doing things. And these are the kinds of things, okay, that will give Americans hope. In 1936, he runs for president again. And he wins again. Now, all these programs, which many years and many people call socialist programs, he looks at and he believes maybe we should tone them down. Because he's a capitalist at heart. And he starts, okay, to take away some of these programs or to reduce some of them. And then all of a sudden the markets, okay, and everything else starts to go back down again, and a recession starts to reoccur. And so he realizes, okay, that he needs to continue with some new programs to continue the economy so that it will keep people going and keep things, okay, going in the right direction. In reality, the World War II is what solves the Great Depression. The fact of the matter is that when the war begins and our involvement in the war occurs, the fact of the matter is that the war industry is what essentially gives the United States our real solution to the Great Depression. Now, let's understand, when the war started September the 1st, 1939, with the invasion of Poland by Germany, the United States had absolutely no interest in joining a war. America First was a slogan that was designed by many people in the United States at that time for the purpose of keeping the United States out of war. One of its leading figures was Charles Lindbergh. He did not want the United States, involved in any kind of war. And this, was the way in which he and many other leaders, essentially looked at it as a European war that did not impact and should not impact the United States. That was their war, and did not want, the United States, to be involved. However, all that changed on December 7th, 1941. And that, of course, changed the course of history. Everyone, at that particular time realized, that we would enter the war. It was going to be a two-front war with an emphasis, on the European war. And the war, would be emphasized, with great fervor. Many, many men joined the service, as soon as December 7th, occurred. What really was the greatest achievement was the incredible response of the American people. The war industries and the number of ships, the number of airplanes, the number of tanks, how factories were retooled in order to make the opportunity for war materiel, to be made for war purposes. It was an incredible achievement. As I state on the board, Admiral Yamamoto, made that statement, we've awoken a sleeping giant. Of course, the end of the war would all turn out, with the impact of the Manhattan Project. And of course, that impact would haunt us for 45 years, and one can argue still impacts us now 80 years later. So this Cold War, designed as the mutual assured destruction, or MAD, with many connotations there, implied, that we would therefore develop many different nuclear warheads, despite the fact that one would be sufficient, and then, allow us to live in this era of fear. Of course, at the time, we looked upon this as a two-nation issue between the United States and eventually, the Soviet Union. But now, of course, there are over a dozen countries that have this capacity. But today we live in an age, where maybe what we thought was somewhat logistically capable to have some kind of control, we live in an age where, in many ways, one could argue, we have less control. Because the age of terrorism, we don't know who the enemy is necessarily. It's not state terrorism. We don't know exactly, where that terrorism, is found. And so we've had issues that have made it more and more difficult for us to be able to determine what is going on, both internationally as well as domestically. So it's a different kind of a situation. So 9/11 for us, okay, has become a huge concern as we have tried to determine, okay, how to respond to this elusive enemy, if you will, that, okay, has become more and more difficult for us to be able to determine and understand. So, although I'll start with our national scandals that confronted us in the 1970s, I could have started with a very important 4-year event that haunted our country in the 1950s called McCarthyism. This Red Scare, where people were accused of being communists without any evidence and yet polarized our nation to the point of irrationality, was an important, I would call, scandal. However, my point really is about how national scandals have changed our views on government. And for that reason, I'm going to start with the 1970s. The Vietnam War has swept our country in the 1950s and 60s, but it started a cycle of mistrust that has really swept our country to the present day. So our entry into the war had a great deal to do with a lack of historical understanding, as well as a belief that does not seem to have had the merit that people attached itself to, namely the domino theory. So just to understand, because of what had happened in Europe after the Soviet Union, okay, had essentially taken over several European countries, there was this notion that communism was going to attract and be taken over country by country, similar to what had happened to Poland and Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania in Europe, and that these kinds of things would be happening in East Asia as well. And so there was this concept, okay, that if we didn't pay close attention, those kinds of things would be happening in Asia. And so this notion of domino theory was something that was of concern. We also put faith in a historical inaccuracy that the Chinese, okay, were going to take over Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia, without realizing historically that those nations hated the Chinese implicitly. And so therefore, that likelihood was probably not going to happen. However, okay, not understanding that historical, okay, truism, okay, we unfortunately made our conclusions probably somewhat erroneously. But the scandal that occurred was the printing of the Pentagon Papers by Daniel Ellsberg in 1971. As a reporter, okay, he got hold of information that essentially found a lot of information that proved that the government had been lying about what had been transpiring through the 1950s and 60s about their involvement in Vietnam. And this scandal, okay, just rocked, okay, the country. And people then, okay, really started to have a real negative, okay, about how could they trust the government when, okay, this information was released. The second important scandal of that time frame was also the Watergate scandal. And the Watergate scandal was equally, okay, difficult to accept. President Nixon's re-election committee, okay, had invaded the Watergate apartment complex and tried to get information from the Democratic headquarters about the 1972 election, which ironically, they were way ahead in the polls. It was almost like they didn't really need the information because they were doing pretty well. But nonetheless, okay, they were found out, and the fact of the matter is that as more information was being found out, it was also determined that they were lying more and more about the fact that they were involved. And the more that they were lying, the more complicit, okay, they became, and it became more and more, okay, earth-shattering to people to find out that the president was more and more complicit. It wasn't just his committeemen, it wasn't just his aides, it wasn't just, okay, others who were involved, but he himself, okay, had been personally involved in many of the decisions that were going on. And, okay, all of these things were causing, okay, people to get more and more upset. So it got to the point that the House and Senate committees, chaired by Republican leaders, were basically, okay, making decisions that they were holding him culpable, as well as his aides. The Supreme Court, in a 9-0 decision, essentially said he did not have executive privilege to be able to not turn over tapes. They basically, okay, said that he could not, okay, do this. And finally, the House was ready to impeach him. And it seemed like the Senate would probably go ahead and remove him from office. He saw the writing on the wall. And so he resigned on August the 9th, 1974. So the decision-making, the checks and balances that our Constitution put together, that we studied in the second lecture, fulfilled itself with our legislature, our judicial branch, doing, okay, exactly, okay, as it was expected to do. But there were other scandals. And the parties, okay, didn't matter, okay. You have the Iran-Contra scandal with President Reagan, okay, where we weren't supposed to sell arms, and we were selling arms, and then there were scandals about this, and the government wasn't supposed to do it. The Congress found out about it, and then they lied about it, and so that became a concern. Most of us are familiar with the Monica Lewinsky case, okay, a moral dereliction, okay, upon the president. Nothing of a governmental action, okay, was suspect, but certainly, okay, a moral dereliction. And then the Iraqi war. As we got to the point where we got ready for the war, what do we see? We see, okay, the United States delivering information that was inaccurate. Okay, there is, okay, weapons of mass destruction when there weren't weapons of mass destruction. And so we started, okay, to send and give information that was inaccurate, and knowingly so. So all of these kinds of scandals are the types of things that during these past 50 years have given Americans a distrust of government. And this distrust of government, okay, has been, okay, a matter that has caused, I think, Americans to lose faith. However, this 40 or 50 years of unabated government bashing has also contributed to it as well. It's one thing, okay, to have what is called these scandals that have a truth behind it, but then we have to look at the fact that there's a lot of things that go on in which there may not be truth behind it. In other words, talk radio has allowed unfiltered stories to gain wide acceptance by the masses without substantiated basis. And thus, more and more people are getting information that doesn't necessarily have, okay, a truth behind it. And what happens is that because there is truth behind some things that we don't like, it becomes easier to hear, okay, other things that are not necessarily true, and easier to believe, okay, other truths that are not truths. And these falsehoods, okay, just become greatly acceptable, if you will. Similarly, cable has made it possible for the opportunity for widespread conspiracy theories. And they have grown and grown, it seems, again, without substantiation. And so it's very difficult, okay, to separate, okay, truth from fiction. And difficult for people to be able to understand. So the notion of whether or not something is actual versus something that is fabricated becomes more difficult. But at the base, it's having to do with the fact that the distrust has been placed in front, and it's become difficult to make that separation. And finally, social media has given isolated theories a platform for those who have limited adherence. So what we see is people who have very, very weird ideas have real easy access to people who also have those weird ideas. And that now makes it easier for them to feel as if I must be right. Add all of these up, and we're living in a world in which we are having a greater difficulty to separate between truth and fiction. So without understanding, and most of us don't do an in-depth learning, we don't study and go into, okay, recognizing and deciding or determining what is fact or fiction. It's easier for us to believe a friend that comes up to us and says, "Did you know what I just heard?" And do we substantiate it? Do we, okay, look further into it? Or do we accept it? And that difficulty has made us into, okay, a situation in which we're having a greater difficulty separating truth from falsehood. And then we have technology. Technology's influence on the role of government. As a result, technology and its rapid growth, it's been difficult for the government to control its excesses and to protect the people from the pull of what many call the dangers of unfiltered and unguarded abuses that technology unleashes. With both transportation and communication changes from the 19th and 20th century, the government needed to deal with those advances. The design of roads, for example, the interstate highway system in the late 1950s. Our skies, with the importance of planes and jets, the FAA, the same with communication, radio, television, the FCC. In other words, government has been able to, with advances in both technology and transportation and communication, has been able to make regulations and determine and make ways for us to deal with those, and helping us to be able to deal with those technological changes. With technology, as I mentioned, the advances have been so rapid and rampant that it has been more difficult for the government to pass reasonable legislation to protect the American people. Yet, the question on the slide is imperative. What are the impacts of rapid technological development on learning, entertainment, wellness, society, privacy, and truth? This is not an easy question. And yet, we're all searching for that answer through a technology that keeps changing so rapidly that it's almost impossible, for the government to be able to come up with responses that will help answer these very questions. This is not something that you can turn around and blame the government and say, why aren't you doing something? When in actuality, if they solved one aspect tomorrow, it could be actually, no use the next day. So it's a modern dilemma. Our modern times may be difficult for our current government to do what it needs to do to protect the people. The question that challenges us most today may very well be the last question. How does government respond to growing calls for efficiency and transparency while safeguarding the public and its institutions against the influence of private tech companies?
Tech companies are part of the government now.
Pardon?
The tech companies are part of the government now. We just have a 10% stake in Intel. And the concentration of billionaires that are controlling it all.
You raise a very important concern.
An oligarchy.
Yeah.
The other thing, you allude to it, and then when you talk about AI, but the volume of information we get now, I don't remember the stat, but I heard it out there regarding the number of deep fakes, and it was when the new Pope was named, within 24 hours, the number of deep fake things, Pope says this, and if it's happening with him, it's happening with government officials, and they're almost undiscernibly good,
Right.
deep fakes are now.
Right.
So how do you even sort out news at all?
I mean, in the last pick, we talk about AI, and AI, of course, is uncontrollable at this particular juncture, how do you discern the two between them? I'm not trying to be bleak. I'm trying to be, authentic, because we want to blame the government because it's not doing its job or what we think its job is, but its job is extremely, difficult given, what is happening, and therefore we need to at least recognize that in the first, and then we need to recognize how to fix it. So this is my fix. One thing we could start doing is educating everybody. This is what the founders said. Let's take one quote after the other. This is what they said 200 plus years ago. A popular government without popular information or the means of acquiring it is but a prologue to a farce or a tragedy. Ouch. Or perhaps both. Knowledge will forever govern ignorance. Don't we hope? And a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives. James Madison. Whenever the people are well informed, they can be trusted with their own government. That whenever things get so far wrong as to attract their notice, we're noticing, aren't we? They may be relied on to set them right. To rights. That's our hope, is it not? Thomas Jefferson. Promote as an object of primary importance institutions for the general diffusion of knowledge. It is essential that public opinion should be enlightened. George Washington. Frequent recurrences to fundamental principles is absolutely necessary to preserve the blessings of liberty and keep government free. Benjamin Franklin. Do you think for 1 second that these people who created our government were concerned about an educated populace? We, the people, must be informed. Horace Mann, from Massachusetts, believed that public education was important for every child, not just the rich and the elite. And at the base of that learning was the civic mission, learning about their government, its values, virtues, principles, rights, and obligations. How sad is it that today we bash public education? Maybe we need to elevate it, as Horace Mann explains. See, when you criticize something often enough, does it not become a self-fulfilling prophecy by virtue of our believing it? Think about that. For years we've been doing this, right? public education is terrible. Look at how things are doing poorly in public ed. Keep believing it, it's going to happen. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And it's going to happen. Please note the last quote by Milton, that Horace Mann loved to recite when people believe the wrong things. You get the feeling that that's what's happening sometimes today? Yeah, darkness, be thou my light. So by learning about history in its proper context, we are able to make proper judgments about the present. If we don't know history, or we are encouraged to deny history, we are doomed to accept that which others wish us to believe. The decline of civic education. It may have begun in 1957 with the unintended consequences as a result of Sputnik, October 4th, 1957. I know it seems strange, right? A satellite put into the sky by the Soviets. How did that have to do with the decline of civic education, you say? Well, as a result, the United States believed that we needed to learn more science, more math, and more foreign languages. Consequence? Unintended, might you say. High school courses emphasized as courses up until then surrounded courses that were in the humanities. So everyone learned geography, economics, civics as full-year courses. But now we're going to emphasize science, math, and foreign languages. And I have nothing negative to say about that. But some courses had to leave. And those are the courses that left. By the end of the 1960s, civics courses, for all practical purposes, were mostly electives, especially in Massachusetts. So you might have had a class in Problems in Democracy. And that Problems in Democracy course was an elective. So only kids who wanted to take a course in government got government. Everyone else, didn't have a government course. That's not to say that every government course was great in and of itself. Because even when I went to school, most government courses were, how many years does a senator have for a term of office? Not necessarily, one of those thought-provoking types of questions. "50 years since then, we don't really necessarily understand the importance of constitutional, democratic, and republican government, do we? So where do we go from now? So what are our next steps? Hopefully you will agree with me that we need civic renewal. That includes everything that we've discussed in these 4 weeks. First of all, embrace virtue. Let's try being good. and less emphasis on feeling good. I know that's contradictory nowadays, but okay, hopefully, okay, that makes sense to us. How about understanding key principles? Liberalism, republicanism, constitutionalism. Yes, the importance of natural rights, individual rights, but also the importance of republicanism, the importance of the common good. Civic virtue. And of course, a limited government. The government, okay, that's limited in its powers to do the things that it's supposed to do and not necessarily everything that it wants to do. We've examined the legislative, executive, and the judicial branches. Are they functioning as they were intended to? If not, why not? And finally, promoting civic education holistically through our communities, our schools, our government, and our families. These are the aims that we should have for our civic renewal. Now, this is our last lecture on the foundational understanding that all Americans should have about their government. At least that's what I think. We started by discussing the importance of striving to being good. First and foremost as individuals, but given the purpose and the gift of self-governing that our founders gave us, it's necessary that we, the people, must intentionally be good for the sake of our republic to succeed. To do what we must, to do that, we must be informed, be active, and participate in our government if it is to be preserved. In the last two sessions, we learned or relearned what our cherished principles are and what our rights are, as well as the institutions that were created to deliver and to execute the laws so that our country can benefit everyone, protecting our natural rights as well as the common good, as difficult as that may be. And today, we're looking at the challenges that we've had to endure over the past nearly 250 years. The people have had to respond to these challenges, whether it was a civil war, a depression, or a worldwide crisis involving a nuclear threat, to name a few. Today, we face a war on terrorism, an environmental concern, and what many believe is an authoritarian threat to our democratic values. One thing is certain. Apathy, indifference, and ignorance will doom whatever our framers intended to accomplish with the experiment they achieved with our Constitution and the Bill of Rights and beyond. Let us remember that we, the people, have prevailed in the past, and we can prevail once again. As Benjamin Franklin said after the Constitution was signed, when asked what kind of government do we have, he said, a republic if we can keep it. Let's do our best to keep it. Thank you all for your attention and your commitment.